Okay, welcome everyone. Delighted to have you join us today in the latest of our COMET podcast series, The Risk Factor. Today we are going to be talking about mental health in the workplace versus corporate PR, how seriously our organisations really taking it. I am Craig Smith. I am the Head of Operations and Learning and Development here at COMET. And when I was asked to initially host this podcast, I had to wonder to myself why was it appropriate that I did this. And I really think that mental health and mental health awareness is important to everybody. Everybody in their lives at some point in time will be impacted by this, has been impacted by it directly or indirectly. So it's important for everyone, so it's important to me as well. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by our guest speaker, Jim Grimmer. Jim will introduce himself just shortly, and I think will be really useful in giving us some really excellent insights into the world of corporate mental health and how we're dealing with that. And as I said, hopefully we'll get some really good takeaways from you at the end of this session today as well. So again, thank you for joining us. Jim, welcome. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Craig. Thanks for the invitation to take part. It's a pleasure. Yeah, Jim Grimmer. I founded P3 Business Gear, 20 years in the police in my home city of Aberdeen, 20 years in the oil industry, and I saw that everything as far as employee care was concerned was largely reactive.
Yeah.
Everything always got to a crisis point before somebody got help, somebody went off sick, HR would contact them, etc. So really created P3 to try and turn that on its head, to provide personal, proactive partnership support. So we have our business partners that physically visit a business a couple of times a week, walking the floor, stopping at desks, having conversations, just like this, personal face-to-face.
Yeah.
They then proactively identify and address their issues and get them the help they need before reaching that crisis point. And then the third P is partnership. So working with the company, working with employees, and also immediate family.
Yeah.
Because we know if something's happening with a parent, partner, child, it's impacting you at work.
Of course it is. Well, look, that's obviously fascinating, and the key bit from that is the fact that it's in your world proactive, right, and it's not reactive. And I think we can apply that concept to so many things in the world of risk, mental health, physical health, but that's obviously a key driver for you. So I suppose without stating the obvious, then why is this particular topic then? Why is mental health, well-being, mental health in the workplace being looked after? Why is that so important to you, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen so many people in difficult places during my working life. One of the drivers for me, there was a young guy in his early 30s, worked for one of the big operators in the city, married with 3 children, left his desk one lunchtime, took his own life. That's a guy that on the face of it, everything was okay, good job, well paid, all the material blessings that career had brought him. But I thought, that just shouldn't have happened.
Absolutely.
And if only there'd been someone in that space, someone that sat between work and home, would that have been enough? Would that have given them someone to speak to? So for me, it's become a passion, really. The team, I'm blessed with a great team that share that passion as well. And we've really seen the benefit and the impact of moving to that kind of personal, proactive approach.
Excellent. So it's the power really there of intervention, isn't it? And even having that conversation. And I suppose with yourselves and your business partners, it's not always, you won't necessarily know what the impact of that is, but it's about understanding that by having these conversations, these interventions, whatever you want to necessarily call them, you don't always know the benefit of them right away, but clearly through the work that you're doing and through what we know in the past, through that story, heartbreaking story you just told us, that these things are really important, and that if anything, I think just underpins the importance of having these conversations, today. And we'll talk a little bit, in the theme of today's podcast about sometimes where people don't want to speak up and what some of those challenges are. But we'll get into that, of course, as we go on.
Yeah.
Without going off track too much then, so that's why it's important to you. And as I say, everyone hopefully listening to this and watching this will have their own personal relationship with this theme, and we can all take something away from it then. So, but we'll all have our own different views on it, I guess, and we'll all have our own different, I suppose, maybe sometimes our bias or unconscious bias in terms of how these things should be managed, dealt with, the ability to speak up and so on. So in your experience, and you've plenty, 20 plus years, background experience and all of this, what are some of the very typical myths, if you like, around mental health in the workplace and how those are being dealt with that you see out there that you'd like to try and challenge and bust those today if you could?
Yeah, I think still that if you open up about a mental health issue, it's seen as a sign of weakness. I think that's still very prevalent. Despite there's been a lot of good work done, over the last number of years, but I still think that's very relevant.
Okay.
And I think it takes strength for someone to actually open up in the workplace that I am struggling with an issue, but I think that can be an example, because very often you'll find you're working with colleagues that when someone does have the courage, if you like, to open up, someone else will say, well, actually, I'm in that place as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that, again, if you open up about a mental health issue, that you can't manage the challenges of your job.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think very often it's people that are, on the face of it, top performers. They get everything done, working to deadlines,
absolutely.
they're working under pressure that you think is managing everything, but very often below the surface they can be struggling as well.
Absolutely.
And I think companies have got to realise holistically that we can't separate work from life.
Yeah.
If something is going on in that space at home, ultimately be impacting you at work.
Yeah.
And if you're under pressure and stress at work, it will be impacting often relationships at home as well. So
absolutely. I'm seeing a lot now, and I'm new to the world of TikTok, Jim. I don't know if you're on TikTok, but I've newly joined that world now. That's where I get a lot of my news from, rightly or wrongly, of course. But I'm seeing a lot now with people that are, showing themselves in a different light and a light into different people's lifestyles. And there's this kind of 9 to 5 versus my 5 till 9. And what you do in that sort of 4 hours before bed after work is obviously so important to try and get that separation. But I think to your point there, actually those lines can be very blurred, and actually perhaps the answer is not absolutely getting separation, but knowing how to blend the two. And maybe for some people, if we relieve some of that pressure around the kind of 9 to 5, and as you rightly say, the top performers, some people might have the sort of view that, well, actually you should never be working beyond that 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. You should never be working on a Saturday morning because that should allotted working hours. But actually it's not as simple as that, is it? And I suppose if people can, there's two things here. If people can figure out a better way of working, perhaps, but more importantly, I think organizations are able to, and leadership in their organizations are able to allow these things to happen, then perhaps you relieve the mental health fatigue and stress, and you might even increase productivity, because somebody might work better at 8 p.m. at night, not at 9 p.m. in the morning. They might work better on a Saturday morning, at home over the kitchen, breakfast bar, as opposed to being kind of stuck in the office. So to your point about less blurred lines and actually blending it together, it's maybe not traditional, but maybe that's a step forward organizations in this space need to be considering.
I think COVID changed the whole working environment massively.
Yeah.
I think we've seen a big push recently for companies to get employees back into the workplace. I think at times, it shows a bit of uncertainty by management that employees are doing what they need to be doing ultimately. But conversely, I think employees have found it really helpful and beneficial for those that think, okay, my best working time is in an evening. And let's be real as well, not everybody's working a 9 to 5.
Exactly.
When I had conversations with people in the oil industry and you mentioned 9 to 5, to say, oh, what is that?
What's that?
You're in at 6 in the morning till 6 at night.
Maybe
more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know a lot of people get value from what they do. There's a buzz. I mean, I'm in the same place you are as well. I know, from previous background and jobs that we did, you give everything to your job at times.
Yeah,
I think where you've got to be careful is it doesn't become everything to the exception of everything else. And that's where putting boundaries is critical, I think. And I think leadership comes from the top. And I think it's up to leaders to put in that boundaries. I think if you're saying one thing and doing another, often companies will be promoting, well, we're a company that promotes work-life balance, etc. But then when an employee starts in that role, you see everyone working till 7 o'clock at night before they walk out the office, and all of a sudden they're thinking, oh, where did this work-life balance go, kind of thing. So, but each to their own, I guess. But I think from my own personal experience, I've been in that place of committing far too much time to work and letting that kind of take over. And then you're not getting time for rest, you're not getting time for social, for family, etc., etc. So that can have its own impact. So,
which we know is it's hugely important to that kind of productivity piece here. And you've spoken a lot about your experience in your company, and of course here at COMET, where our world is about helping organisations better look at and understand their risk profile. We do a lot in the space, of course, of human factors and understanding how the influences that impact the human, and the ability to have that balance, but also have the right, home life, whatever that looks like, because it's different for everyone. So without even generalising, it's different for everyone. How positively that can impact the day job, so to speak, is absolutely there. It's true, and that's so important.
And you're supporting companies working in different time zones,
That's right, absolutely.
which
Yes.
brings another,
which it does. And again, that's got to be, we've got to realise that as well, because everyone deserves the same level of support and things. So, well, you've touched on it already, then you begin to speak about how well organisations are doing it a little bit. We've kind of drifted into that space already. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes on that, if you don't mind. So again, in your experiences then, when you see an organisation that take it seriously, and I mean take seriously really the kind of mental health, the well-being of their people, their staff, their contractors, their supply, whatever that looks like, could you give me, do you think, an example of an organisation that you've worked with or that you've at least come across in your time that have done that well, and what made it good, what made it stand out, what made it different to others that are maybe just paying a little bit of lip service that you kind of alluded to?
Yeah, coming back to COVID, one of our clients, Bore Drilling, Darren Sutherland, Vice President, reached out to me in the middle of 2021 and asked if he could get a proposal for P3 support, because the start of 2022, he was going to be taking employees back into the office, and he realised a lot had been happening in COVID that he'd be totally unaware of. So I thought a lot of them, personally, for having the foresight to actually be looking ahead. We started support in 22, normally with a 3-month pilot. We then got feedback from the employees, and we found that it's been very helpful. I think in this kind of care space, some employees have got a strong peer network, are well supported. So some of the feedback was, we thank a lot of the company for putting this support in place, but I'm okay, and that's great. Other employees had found it very helpful and beneficial in having someone to speak to about everything that had happened. I think Darren is a good example, and we'll maybe come on to this. I think he was in a senior level within the company and recognised we need to be looking at the potential challenges staff will be having. So it's been driven from the top down. And that is kind of filtered through the organisation on a global basis, because Bore Drilling are now a company with 1,200 staff globally in very many different sites. So that's extended the supporting staff on and offshore, Congo, for example. It's also not just been an HR initiative, it's QHSE have become involved in it's driving the message of P3. So yeah, I think Bore are a great example. Darren Sutherland will maybe speak about his work in IADC, International Association of Drilling Contractors in Mental Health and Energy. So he's a guy that I think should be congratulated for having the foresight and being driven to try and improve well-being in the energy sector.
So it's about action, isn't it?
Yeah.
What you've really described there well is action that's been taken, identifying the risk and the potential underlying problems that comes with not doing something about it and being proactive around it, and actually taking action. And the example you've used through Bore Drilling, they've reached out to yourselves and your team for that support, which is fantastic. Of course, there will be other ways in which that can happen as well. But the kind of underlying takeaway I think from that is actual identifying the need and taking action, right? Practical steps to do something.
They're a company that had, many companies have got a traditional employee assistance program, BPA, healthcare, etc. So they had things in place already, but I guess you saw the potential value in the kind of unique model of PC support and taking that into the company for the employees and their family.
Fantastic. So just very briefly then, on the flip side of that then, because it's very easy to skim over the top of it and look at a good example. What's a bad example? I don't want you to name a company here perhaps, Jim, that might not go down so well. What's the characteristics of a bad example then, where maybe companies simply aren't taking action? What can that look like?
It's interesting. October 2023, there was a survey published in People Management. So that's an online magazine that is created as part of the CIPD. So that's the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and that's a lead body for HR. So if you're in HR in any role, you will be part of the CIPD. And that survey revealed that 8 out of 10 UK employees didn't believe their employer when they were promoting wellbeing initiatives. So I think that tells you a lot without naming names, kind of thing. And I think companies have to be careful in this space, because you can be seen to be promoting on social media, for example. Part of what we do for our clients is to focus on a monthly topic. And that might be an internationally recognised topic, stress awareness in November, dry January, etc., cutting back on alcohol. When you see companies actually promoting a nationally recognised campaign, but then you have conversations with someone else in the business, you get a totally different story. So companies from a corporate kind of responsibility perspective, their own reputation, I think you've got to be careful in that space. You can't be speaking a good game and doing something else. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. It can be very easy, I think, anyway, personally, for organisations to talk a good game, as you touched on earlier on. But when you then start to dig a little bit deeper and you really start to speak to people that those policies should be impacting, and they're saying, well, it's not. That's the real proof in the pudding, isn't it? That it comes out in that. So. Yeah. So yeah, and again, it does take us back to that kind of taking real action, I suppose, and how that leadership top down and how that then manifests itself and the parts of an organisation that it really needs to, and that can't happen overnight either. None of this is a quick fix, of course.
No,
that can't happen.
No, right? But it's got to start somewhere.
It's got to start.
You've got to take that first step. So
good.
And I think it's critical that when you're looking at what is it you're going to be providing, you're taking feedback from employees, not just introducing something that everyone else seems to be introducing. So we'll introduce that as well. Mental health first aiders, I think, is an example we'll maybe speak about. But so you've got to be careful in that space as well. And I think you've got to have these conversations with your employees and find out what, not everybody wants a yoga workshop or whatever it might be. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you need to be asking them the questions and then taking that feedback and saying, okay, this is a consensus of what the majority are looking for. How can we provide that support to employees?
Excellent. Well, there we go. There's a couple of excellent takeaways already. Do you like stats and data, Jim?
Yep, fire away.
Data drop.
You can't get away from them.
No, absolutely, you can't these days. Data drop. I'm going to introduce a new term first of all, and I'm going to ask you to elaborate and expand on that a little bit if you can. Presenteeism. Okay, so I suppose in many ways, is that the opposite from absenteeism? So I have to admit, of course, familiar with I think we all kind of grasp what we mean by absenteeism, but presenteeism is something definitely new to me. So here we go. Poor mental health costs UK employers an estimated £56 billion annually. Okay, with £28 billion due to presenteeism. Okay, employees working at work, of course, whilst unwell in some shape, form, or capacity. I find that quite astounding. What's your thoughts on that? And please expand on presenteeism for our audience.
That figures you mentioned come from a survey that's compiled by Deloitte, which is again another resource I would always be encouraging people to go and get good data from. Presenteeism, it's not a new term. It was coined by Professor Cary Cooper back in the 1990s to, as you say, it's for employees that are turning up to work, being present but not being productive. And that happens for a variety of reasons. We've been there, let's be honest. We'll have all been there when we rock up for work one day and for whatever reason we're feeling rubbish, whatever it might be, whatever the cause of that might be, and we're not productive that day, and that will always happen. But the problem is when you start getting people that are turning up in that space every day and being unproductive. And, a simple example, somebody is carrying a cold, a virus or whatever, and maybe fearful of taking the day off because they've got a big workload and they think, if I take 2 days off, what am I coming back to?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's picking up the work. What will my colleagues think? What will my boss think if I phone in sick? Of course, they keep coming to work and really being unproductive, struggling to get through the day. And then what happens is they spread their virus to their working colleagues, and then that colleagues are in the same place. So they're back in that space. Oh, I can't take a day off. And before you know it, you've lost a whole week or 2 weeks productivity from a team. And it just shows you the potential costs of presenteeism. I mean, leaveism, have you heard of that?
That's a new one.
So
a new one.
That's another professor from Manchester University. And that was people taking holidays to catch up in their work.
People taking
holidays
to catch up in their work.
So they're not taking holidays to go on holiday or have rest. They're taking days off to try and catch up.
So they're taking a day off
on their workload.
So they're not being disturbed by the usual day-to-day, but they can get on with it in peace.
Right.
Wow.
And it's like, so people go off for a week, they'll put their out of office on, and you think, okay, they're off, and there'll be emails to answer when you come back and all the rest of it, which is fine. But these are people that's taking their leave to try and catch up or get ahead of their work. So it's incredible.
I mean, that's that to me, without going wildly kind of off-piste here as well, that to me really does sound like a workload management issue, but not on the individual necessarily, but on how who's not foreseeing the risks and the dangers with that, and where again, a lot of what we're talking about does come back to leadership, doesn't it? And the effectiveness around that and how people are seen in the workplace. And one of the things, a couple of things you mentioned a little bit earlier on there was, in terms of that people actually wanting to come into their work. You kind of mentioned it, but the stigma then of not being at work is a very real thing, I suppose, isn't it? That people don't want to get tarnished with that kind of reputation. And so, unless you are really badly, you're laid up in hospital with a broken leg or whatever, then you're going to make it in. But of course, we all know again, the kind of, the adverse impacts that can have, both physically, of course, and mentally.
Yep.
But again, it's a fine line, because a lot of people might be listening to this discussion now and be thinking, yeah, but we also can't have a productive workplace or economy with a workforce, now, a younger workforce coming through now, that it's okay to, take a day off sick because you've got a tickly throat, or you've had you maybe had an argument with your partner the night before and you don't quite feel great, so you want to take a day off work, because that's not productive either. So where's the, I hear what you're saying, but where's the kind of middle ground, I suppose? What's the where do we want to be at?
It is a challenge. I think one of the things with the younger generation, they're paying far more attention to how is a company going to care for me. And that's coming into, am I going to actually go and work for this company? So they're far more aware. We would have been glad of getting the job. Okay, we'd apply for the job. Okay, we wanted the job, we get it, that's great. And then you start in that role, and then you kind of find out everything else is happening, right? But they are far more proactive and looking at this business. Is this a business that's going to care for me? And bearing in mind as well, if they don't, they'll be shipping out, because we know that younger generation are very mobile and it no longer seeing a job for life. But yeah, I think, again, it comes from modelling in some respects, good relationship with a line manager, that they would know. I think if you're managing your team well, you'll get to know that individual. You'll get to know, is this, if you want to say, a genuine kind of absence, or maybe they've called in with something and then they're back the next day and you actually have that conversation. You're saying, look, it's not like you to be off, but why were you off yesterday? Was it just a bug, or is there anything else going on, that kind of thing? So yeah, it's difficult because, people are off genuinely, obviously, for a whole variety of reasons. And maybe that younger generation are more susceptible to taking a day off, a duvet day, or whatever you want to call it. Whereas your older generation might be saying, you see people retire from their work after 20 years, never having had a day off work, you know what I mean? It's amazing. But we'll all get in that space of having that kind of bug or whatever it might be. But yeah, it's just trying to, I think, through the relationship you have with your team, knowing them and knowing how they kind of operate and being an encouragement to them as well. But setting an example. I think I've always been a great believer in that. Any company I've worked for, bosses I've worked for, have always kind of set an example that I think, yeah, it's somebody I want to be like them. I want to follow them.
So hence modelling, of course.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, and hey,
Yeah.
I will never knock the odd DVD. I'll say that right now. And let's change the focus a little bit from looking at, we could probably sit here all day and talk about the kind of organisational aspect of this, and we'll come back to it a little bit, but let's focus more on an individual, personal level then. You did bring up the kind of term stigma earlier on. And again, this is something that we absolutely can all relate to, and I'm sitting right here can relate to it as well, in terms of, a conversation, with you and what I'm learning from you right now. But what might be a blocker? Why if somebody in the workplace right now, today, listen to this podcast, and as I said, this topic affects everyone. What do you see as being a major blocker and why somebody would not want to open up, speak up, whether it's a friend, family, colleague, boss, whatever? What's a blocker these days, do you think, for somebody saying, not for me, I'm going to bottle this and I'm going to deal with it myself?
Great question. I remember when I was looking at creating P3, I was having conversations with guys that worked in the oil industry with an employee assistance program. So that kind of support was there. And 4 things come back from that conversations. Number 1, often they didn't know they had support available. Number 2, there's no way I'm phoning a 0800 number and speaking to someone I've never spoken to before. Number 3, if I did, and this was a big one, would have leaked back to management and I'd find myself on a list of redundancies as a way of solving the problem. Or if I did, it'd be a last resort and I'm back into that space and going off sick and being plugged in. Oil industry wise, I think there's still a stigma of you go off a rig, for example, with a mental health issue. You'll have heard that term being blackballed, means for all that's said to you face to face, there will be a perception this person's got a mental health problem, we're not taking him back offshore again. So that is a massive challenge for someone that's in that space offshore to be opening up about having a mental health challenge when there is a potential to potentially lose their job is a massive, massive challenge. And I think some industries as well being pretty male dominated and the stereotypical guy being weak to be opening up about issues as well as another problem. So you just get that increasing burden of trying to deal with something on your own, which is never good. So yeah, I think there is still stigma, and I think it's probably the one thing that we need to try and get over. We need to try and get in that place where it's okay to not be okay. We've had that term spoken, a lot in the last few years, but it's transforming a sentence into something that becomes a reality within a business. That's what companies have to be looking at and how they can implement that.
So I suppose, I asked you a question there to try and trigger a train of thought, and you've, your response there was to kind of jump to where I thought you would go, which was stigma. And I suppose I would challenge that a little bit, if I'm being honest. Is that still the case these days? We do a lot of, we as a company do a lot of training, and we do a lot of delivering, we speak to a lot of people, and particularly in the kind of, we are probably, when I talk about this, we are, maybe when we talk about stigma, is it more of a male-oriented thing, not to talk up over a female, perhaps? I don't know. But I hear a lot more now in the last year that, no, we do speak up, and it's a lot more acceptable and normalised now to do it. So, is there still stigma?
No, in certain sectors, I think.
Yeah.
Just as an example, offshore industry, when things are so tight in the industry and challenges financially for companies and looking to cut staff, if you're looking at my job as being at risk, along with a number of others, am I going to open up about a mental health issue or a welfare issue, whatever? Unlikely. I think you're right. It's we wouldn't have been having this conversation a few years ago. I mean, there's been so much has been done, a lot of good things to improve awareness of well-being and mental health. and to encourage people to be able to open up. I think how they do that is still a challenge, ultimately, as I touched on an employee assistance program. And still, what I see is a very low take-up of an AAP. A company's paying for an AAP somewhere along the line, although it might be promoted as a free add-on. But somewhere you're paying that, because somewhere there's a big call centre sitting with 100 staff in it. Before COVID, the traditional AAP, as I call it, had an average 5% take-up. And I was surprised at that figure, but that was actually being promoted by the AAP organisation themselves. And then post-COVID, that's up to kind of 12 to 14%. So I still think that's pretty low. Mm-hmm. Because when we run employee surveys, have you engaged with your P3 business partners? 82%. So, yeah, I think, coming back to your point about stigma, I think there is still stigma in certain industries in particular, but it's certainly improved a lot more from what it was 5 to 10 years ago even.
Okay, fair point. And I mean, you've touched on a lot there as well around about reasons, of course, why somebody might not want to speak up, and I think you've given very valid, fair examples that a lot of us can relate to. But I suppose the flip side to this as well is, do you say no one wants to phone up an 0800 number and speak to somebody they've never heard of or met before, and what happens with that information, the kind of whole confidential piece as well. But if we think about the flip side to that, then if I'm going to reach out to, let's say, the first, in an organisational setting, if I'm going to reach out to, let's say, my line manager and have a discussion around this, what sort of skills do they need to be able to deal with this effectively? Because it's all very well and good encouraging the workforce and everyone in there to speak up, but if that first point of call is quite often maybe with somebody in a direct line or a colleague, what skills do we then need to be able to respond appropriately to that and then give the right advice? How do you, in your experience, where would you go with that?
Yeah, there was I raised my head above the parapet in 2019. There was an article in the Guardian newspaper about the number of FTSE 100 companies that had trained staff as mental health first aiders. There was like 10,000 people who had been trained. And I shared this on LinkedIn, and I asked the question, is this been effective, or has it become the latest tick box exercise? Like Investors in People was the flavour of the day, if you want. And for those old enough to remember, TQM, Total Quality Management. And you can imagine every training company was on me like a ton of bricks. And I'm saying, hold on a sec. I've done the 2-day mental health first aid training course. My team do it. I think it's an excellent course. But the very nature of first aid tends to be given after there's been an injury, okay? But I think for management, I think it is an excellent course to go on. So I would encourage every line manager to do the 2-day mental health first aid training course, to do some training on listening skills, and not be jumping ahead thinking you've got the answer, which we can often be so guilty of, and especially as a manager. And again, just try to develop that openness. And coming back to that word you use, modelling, I think a line manager, when employees are seeing a good work-life kind of situation being modelled by a manager, it's something they can look upon. And then, of course, that's reducing the resistance they might feel by going to a line manager and say, hey, I'm struggling. What's been interesting as well, some of the situations we've found, we've been supporting companies with employees that are opening up about being totally stressed. We need their permission to go and raise this issue with a line manager, but often we will get that. So one situation, for example, when we went to the line manager and had that conversation, when we started digging into a bit more of what was causing this, it turned out the employee was doing things that was actually the client's responsibility. So when the line manager took that away from them, of course, that reduced their workload. So that brought a kind of resolution to that situation. So, but yeah, I think there's lots out there that line managers can be open to. There's so many good online courses, so it's not taking you out the office particularly to spend time, etc. But yeah, I think the mental health first aid training, it is interesting that there was a survey of 8,000 employees over 60% would not disclose a mental health issue to their employer for some of the reasons I think we've spoken about. So bless them, mental health first aiders. I admire the people that step up to do that role, wanting to provide support to their colleagues. But conversely, I've had a conversation with it was a big legal firm in Aberdeen, trained 6 staff as mental health first aiders. An employee in that business said, yeah, 6 people, and one of them's a young girl that sits in the basement office. Lucky if she sees 6 people a day. So bless that girl for doing it and wanting to be trained and being open to doing that. But how many people she got engaged with? And I had a conversation with a mental health first aider that leads a team for a significant operator in the city, who was honest enough to say that he could count in one hand the number of people that had come to him in the last 3 years as a mental health first aider. So it's coming back to what you're saying about being careful about companies seeing this as a panacea. Well, you've got 6, 10, 20 people trained as mental health first aiders, and then thinking, that'll take care of any health issues kind of thing. Plus, then that begs the question: you've got mental health first aiders, who's taking care of them? Because I know from my own experience and the P3 business partner team, that when you're in supporting employees in that space, you'd be pretty draining. So you're asking somebody to be a mental health first aider and potentially manage, a heavy workload and everything that goes on in that space as well. So I think it's a duty of care on companies that do have mental health first aiders to be looking at that as well.
Thanks, Jim. I think that is an excellent point that would often get overlooked. And you being controversial on LinkedIn, I would never have thought that. Time for a second data drop then, if you don't mind, Jim.
Yep.
And look, the whole point of this conversation here today, of course, is to try and raise a little bit of awareness, but talk about things that maybe should be talked about a little bit more, and around mental health. And we haven't. There's lots and lots of different types of mental health out there as well. We haven't really touched on in today's podcast, and of course, people will know what a lot of these things are. There's a lot of very obvious things, but of course, what we're trying to do here is kind of get to an area where it's not about necessarily always about prevention. It's about kind of management and understanding what the risks are, what the signs are, what the early triggers are, and how we as individuals can actually help, manage ourselves a little bit better as well. But of course, at the end of the day, it doesn't always go that way. And of course, one of the real tragic outcomes where somebody, through mental health is not managed very well, of course, can be suicide. In 2023, Jim, 5,656 suicides were registered in England, with men being disproportionately affected. So over 3-to-1 ratio in terms of males being affected. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. Sadly, I think the male-female thing. I think it would probably in all our experiences we'll know our partners, girlfriends, etc., tend to be better in that space. They've got a good network of friends and meeting up, and we know even when we're out together, I can't get a word in edgeways, right? But whereas men tend to be completely different. And I think they're often very surface conversations, even with good friends. So, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. The SAMH, Scottish Action for Mental Health, run a course called ASSIST, Applied Suicide Intervention Skills Training. I've done that course probably in all my police career and time in the oil industry, probably one of the best courses I've ever done. It's a 2-day course. The second day, second half is kind of role play, as you might expect. And that's about identifying potentially someone that you think could be thinking about taking their own life. I think often you will see a change in somebody's demeanour, ultimately, life and soul, but maybe not so much. Or conversely, someone who's, I think to be careful, and I heard a story about this recently, someone that was kind of doom and gloom, shall we say, suffering, and then the next day appeared at work full of joys of spring, ultimately. So such a, gone from real depression to a high kind of thing, and sadly took their own life. So there is that change, and I think that happens because research will show that they've made a decision. This is what I'm going to do. So it's almost a release of that burden of what they've been trying to deal with, and because they've made that decision, it's changed their mental health and their thinking. I think another thing would be I think people have a misconception around suicide. Well, I shouldn't mention it. Don't mention the word. But actually, assist training will encourage you to ask that question: are you contemplating taking your own life? And that's where the role play was good, because not everybody would say right away, yes, I am. You know what I mean? You've got to have that persistence in that conversation, and then the next question is: have you formulated a plan? Because often people will have moved to that place of thinking, okay, if I'm going to do this, how am I going to do it? And we know for men, it's often something physical, hanging, whatever, that kind of thing. So yeah, sadly, I don't think I'm surprised by that statistics. And generally, the whole thing with pressures on society and everything that we've been seeing over this last few years, I think is feeding into that ultimately as well.
Yeah, look, it's an area that we don't want to, of course, it's an area we don't want to be talking about it, but it's important that we do. And I think that point you make on the training and the ability to then ask further questions, and I think there's things that could come out of that for us all. And how often when you meet you meet one of your colleagues, you meet one of your friends, family members, whoever it is, and you say, "How's it going today?" 99 times out of 100, you get that response, "Yeah, fine, thanks, yourself."
Yeah.
Whereas actually, maybe quite a lot of the time, they're not fine, thanks.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can get, when that, on that 1 in 100 times, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, somebody says, "Well, actually not great," because can take you back a little bit when that happens. But I think that's a really positive step in terms of where we are. But of course, you then as an individual, particularly if it's in a kind of an organizational capacity, have then got to know how to deal with that and respond to that, and what's the kind of follow-up, because you might be getting a response that you're not expecting to get to. And again, that takes us back to the conversation earlier on about how well are people equipped in organizations, not just to speak up about this, but actually to deal with it as well. And I think that's a really important point. So yeah, something to think about as well is don't just take the first answer as being the correct answer, because you do a little bit of scratching. And of course, our past lives taught us how to do that quite well, but not everyone has the same intuition.
Yeah, and it's that I'm fine, but how are you really?
Yeah, aye.
And that kind of open-ended questions to speak about kind of thing. And it's maybe an opportunity to then follow that by say, look, I've just been concerned about you because I have seen you're not your usual self, or I know, conversely, maybe if you have a good relationship, as hopefully you would as a line manager, that you know that there's something else going on outside work that is potentially impacting them as well. So yeah, it's asking that question.
Absolutely.
And being persistent, I guess, ultimately.
Agreed. Excellent. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Mental health versus traditional workplace health and safety. This is a path that's been trodden before. And you've already mentioned quite a lot about mental health first aiders, so we don't necessarily need to go down that route again, because I think that's been really useful. Should organizations be so simple question perhaps, should organizations be making the direct correlation between mental health and an individual's ability to work and operate safely in the workplace? How should organizations be making that direct connection? And if so, how do they go about that?
Yeah, definitely. 100%. I mean, health and safety are now putting a responsibility on employers to be recognising that stress is a major impact. I think I mentioned Alan Sullivan at the outset, in his time as chairman of the IADC, he was very proactive in identifying that companies need to be addressing well-being, particularly in a dangerous environment as the offshore energy sector. He created a team called Mental Health and Energy. They produced a white paper, which interestingly has statistics about suicidal thoughts, which were found to be very high. He's got a charter with 10 points to that charter that companies can sign up to. I'm very cautious that I've done it in the past as a manager in a company think this is really good, I'll sign up to the charter. But there's a difference between signing up the charter and actually putting things in place. But yeah, I think he's done a great work, and I think health and safety themselves they've identified these list of management standards that they are looking at. It can be used as a framework, if you like, for a company to look at health and safety and well-being, mental health in their space, and looking at the demands that are being put on staff. Looking at control, the working environment that they're working in, how much say do they have, autonomy do they have in their own kind of role, what support is being made available in whatever circumstances that may be. The roles I touched upon, a clear definition of their job role, and any changes within the business, change management is critical. And I think there's people out there that have made a career of change management. I think that's a potential resource to be drawn on as well, because when you're making a significant change in the business, and as you said earlier, these things don't happen overnight. They need to be bedded in, they need to be reinforced, they need to be demonstrated as well. I remember old days when the company was involved in corporate manslaughter and running training courses, when director level could be held to account for a fatality in their business. And then you think, okay, what's going to happen when somebody suffering from burnout or whatever takes their own life, in a company and director level is going to be held responsible for that. So from a health and safety perspective, again, just as we're touching on, a lot more happened in the last few years to raise awareness and significance. But you can't separate the two. Stress, fatigue, we know will have an impact on how we do our jobs. And that's maybe not so challenging for us when we're sitting in an office in front of a laptop. But when you're offshore, or you're in the rail industry, or driving a train, or whatever it may be, when the opportunity for errors becomes massively reduced, then you've got to be addressing that issue, and that's obviously something health and safety have recognised. Yeah.
Absolutely. At the end of the day, it's a hazard, right? It's a hazard, and whilst we might have to frame it or categorise it slightly differently to traditional, let's say, safety hazards in the workplace that are all fairly well understood,
Yep.
There's no getting away from the fact that it is a hazard, and of course, a hazard that isn't controlled and mitigated, of course, the risk potential then goes through the roof, of course, and of course, then if that hazard then becomes realised, then that's where harm can happen in whatever fashion, level of consequence that is subject to coincidence and luck often. So
yep.
That it has to, I think the kind of point there is that it's, whilst you can't see it or touch it necessarily, doesn't make it any less real.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep, definitely.
Okay. Right, let's sort of get to a point now where let's kind of take it back a little bit in terms of kind of back to organizational takeaways from this, and really moving away and getting to a point where organizations can take real steps, real action to becoming enforcing a little bit around perhaps culture change and making these initiatives perhaps genuine and real and authentic, and not just a box ticking exercise then. So, what can an organization do right now, starting to tomorrow, if you're talking to leadership in an organization, what can they do right now, one clear step forward in this space to do better when it comes to looking out for mental health well-being in the workplace?
I think one step for a leader is, do you know what's happening at grassroots level in your company? I think back, Bob Keeler, who was CEO of a massive organisation, thousands of staff, we Group PSN, as it was back in the day. I thought a lot of what that guy did was a great example. He produced a, monthly video where he shared very openly and honestly some of his personal challenges, things about what was happening in the business. He also promoted that he would answer an email. If an employee sent him an email personally, he would answer that email himself. And I remember being at a presentation when Bob Keeler was speaking on this very topic and how he created values for Wood Group, PSN, etc. And I was struck by that, about the email. And I thought, I'll just send him an email to thank him for his presentation, which I did. And I got a personal reply. Now, if you were being a cynic, you would say, but that was the Bob Keeler. But I totally believe the integrity that man has, that was Bob Keeler. So, yeah, coming back to my point, I think as a business leader, owner, you need to be, and if you don't know what's going on at grassroots level, you need to be taking the time to find out. You need to be coming down onto the shop floor, office, whatever it may be, letting people see you, get to know you, finding out about what's going on in their world, kind of thing. And I think it would really open the eyes of a lot of people, a lot of senior managers who potentially, again, coming back to my point, think, oh, we've got X, Y, and Z in place, everything's okay, but not necessarily the right things. So that would be my one point for leaders. I think for organisations, I think you're a company that focuses on root causes, right? So I think tackling the root cause and not just symptoms in this whole kind of wellbeing space, addressing that workload, lack of control that some people feel that they have, which can lead to stress. Using that health and safety management standards as that framework. I think that's one thing. Training managers, we spoke about, is culture builders. It was Peter Drucker that said back in the day, culture eats strategy for breakfast, kind of thing. And culture in a company is so crucial. So we know that most employees don't quit companies, they quit poor managers, ultimately. Raising that mental health awareness, potentially doing that 2-day mental health first aid training course, assist as well, is all good in there as well. And that soft skills that we often ignore, empathy, listening skills, trying to upskill management in that as well. And then building that psychosocial kind of culture into everyday work. That it's okay not to be okay one day. It's okay to say, I'm going to have to take a day off here because I'm really stressed, kind of thing. I had an excellent example of that recently. Just share that. So a guy who works for a major operator with a team of about 12 people reached out to me and said, Jim, he says, I'm really worried about my team. We've been working excessive hours over the excessive period of time. I think some of them are struggling. Could you do something? And well, that's not really a remit of the model of what we do. I had one of the team go in, he's a trained counsellor, ran a half-day session on stress/burnout. And then if there's any of the team wanted to have a one session with the counsellor, they could do that. And 5 of that team put their hands up and said, I'd like a one-to-one with the counsellor. So we had another half-day session for that. So I think that's a good example from a line management perspective of somebody that is again, it's like that helicopter thing, isn't it? It's being able to step back from the situation you're involved in and see your bigger or wider team and what's actually going on. And to his credit, he could see the impact of this extended period of long hours, hard deadlines, stress, etc., starting to build in his team. But he had the wisdom to do something about it, ultimately. So I think it's a good example of that kind of psychosocial thing at work and addressing issues proactively and putting things in place to help them. And of course, that's then opened a conversation to the bigger P3 picture. Okay, this is going on in a small number of your team. There'll be lots of other people in a company of 300-400 people where these situations are going on. So, good.
Well, this is the segment that we call the root, getting to the root of the matter. And of course, as an organisation that specialises in root cause analysis, we would have to include that within our session. So I'm delighted the example that you gave us actually touched on the fact that getting to the kind of grassroots. So of course, the takeaway there being that one takeaway is truly understand what's going on at a day-in-day level in your organization and learn from that. And it's amazing what might come out of it. But of course, you've equally got to be prepared to do that. So I think that's an excellent takeaway that we can utilize. Jim, before I kind of wrap this up and summarize some of those key points for our viewers and our listeners here, I'd really like to think that everyone that has been listening and watching will have definitely taken away, and I'm a firm believer in taking away at least one thing from any learning opportunity you get. Take away one thing to make a difference is really, really important, and some of the insights that you've offered here is really, really useful. Before I summarize and we get to that kind of wrap up point, if you had the option, if I gave you a 1 minute opportunity, okay, to talk about something that you really would like, something different, something unique, something maybe that the listeners haven't really thought about before, might not realize the value of. Is there anything that you're particularly passionate about that you think could be a really good practical tool, practical help for anyone listening to this to deal with their own mental health? What would that be?
I think it's being willing to be honest. I think very often we can realise deep down that we're struggling, but then we try and self-medicate, as I've done in the past. I've shared openly, years back, particularly in the police, it was a working all hours, partying all hours kind of thing. But really it was probably our means of dealing with the stress of things that we were under at that time, because the support that we have now wasn't available. So I think it's been honest, as I said right at the outset. I think it's got to be seen. It's not a weakness to be putting your hands up and say, help, I need some kind of help here. What I love about P3 is that might just be a cup of coffee and a chat. And that is often enough, particularly for guys, I think, just to have that release valve to be able to speak about what it is it's causing pressure and stress. If it's something bigger, we've then got access to resources that can then provide that help. But I think it's being honest with yourself. And I think I always say, I want to look myself in the mirror in the morning, knowing that I said or I did the right thing, which is a philosophy that I've always had. And I think that's a message for everyone. I think you need to get in that space of being willing to be honest when you know that you're struggling, to be willing to put your hand up and say, I need help. Whether that comes through a friend, not necessarily at work, a partner, whatever it may be, because as guys, we tend to be in that space of just trying to push on. But so many times, sadly, we see these situations with the suicide figures, guys predominantly 45 to 49 taking their own lives. They get to that point where they can no longer sustain and they're unable to open up and be seen as weak, whatever you want to call it. So for the one takeaway is to be honest, to be able to look yourself in the mirror and think, am I in the space I need to be in to be managing everything that is on my plate right now? And if you realise that you're not, it's not a weakness to be putting your hand up and saying, I need help. And there's lots of resources. There's a massive amount of resources now. During COVID, for us to allow contact between employees we're supporting and our P3 business partners, we created an app, my P3 app. When we run employee service, historically that's at a low take-up, maybe around about 8-10%, because I think people get the value of the face-to-face support. But within that app is 200 plus resources. That is simple links to resources. So you can search for dementia, cancer, whatever it might be, and have access to an online support. And we've actually had people that have reached out to our support, have found support in that space, getting support before they've actually opened up to a business partner. But I think that's great. You've got the support. You've been brave enough to open up, to reach out, get the help you need. And that's often what can completely flip the situation around, because 9/10 of the battle is speaking, I think, and be willing to recognise you've got an issue and being able to address it.
Excellent. Jim, I can't thank you enough for coming in and sharing not just that wisdom and insights and experience, but also a lot of those practical tools and those practical things that people can really take away. I think that's what's vitally important here. And if we summarize some of that, then a lot of it comes back to organizations at a leadership level, of course, being proactive and genuinely having that sort of care mentality, and really, I think, learning from within the workforce kind of what's going on and how we're dealing with these things. So that whole proactive space. People, of course, absolutely knowing that it's okay not to be okay, and to speak up and to have those conversations, and it's okay to have an informal chat can go a long way, I think, as you've mentioned as well. And I think yes, I think as time goes on, I think those stats, some of those really disappointing, scary figures around suicides and other things related to mental health will hopefully over time will fall, not rise, but will absolutely fall. And a lot of the things that you're doing with your organisation, but some of the examples you've given us as well, I think are testament to what the good things that can be done. So thank you very much for.
Yeah, I was just close with one line really. Employers can't solve every mental health crisis, but they shouldn't be the cause of one, ultimately.
Excellent. Thank you, Jim. Well, folks, thank you very much for listening and watching our second podcast in the series today about mental health awareness in the workplace. I do hope that you found that very useful. I do hope you found that some useful practical takeaways. Our first podcast, of course, was from catching criminals to catching risk. Look out for the next podcast in the series coming out in the next few weeks. Hopefully, you'll find that useful as well. But from me, your host, Craig Smith, thank you for listening, and I wish you well.